Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who hide the darkest secrets. A woman in a long blue skirt walks through the airport, lost, confused, as if she doesn't belong there. A little girl appears from nowhere, pointing straight at her leg. "Officer, you need to check under her skirt." The woman flinches, gripping the fabric tightly, fear flashing in her eyes. The officer hesitates, unsure of what's happening. But when she finally lifts the skirt, the words written on her leg leave him stunned. "Call for backup." Who is she? Why can't she remember? And how does the little girl know so much about her? The answers lie in a past buried under layers of betrayal, forgotten promises, and painful truths. But once the truth comes out, there's no turning back. Stay with me until the end of this gripping and emotional story. And don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The hum of the airport was a constant murmur of voices, footsteps, and the occasional announcement crackling over the intercom. People rushed past, some dragging suitcases, others staring at their phones, lost in the flow of their own journeys. But amidst the chaos, there was one figure that stood out. A woman, mid-40s, long blonde hair slightly disheveled, her deep blue dress flowing down to her ankles, as if she had stepped out of another time. She clutched a small purse, her fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes, a shade of green dulled by confusion, darted across the terminal like she was searching for something or someone. She didn't know why she was here. The moment she tried to recall where she had been before this, her mind blanked, like a film reel missing entire frames. The sensation wasn't new, but this time, it felt heavier, suffocating. A child's voice broke through the noise. "Officer, you need to check under her skirt." The words sliced through the air like a sharp blade, cutting into the already fragile reality the woman was clinging to. She turned her head toward the sound and saw a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with chestnut brown hair tied into 2 braids, her eyes an almost identical green to the woman's own. The police officer she had spoken to hesitated. "Excuse me, young lady?" The little girl pointed directly at the woman in the blue dress. "You have to check her leg. Please, now." The officer's brow furrowed. "Miss, is there something you'd like to declare?" The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Her body tensed, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as if letting go would mean losing control of something far greater. The girl took a step closer, her small hands shaking. You have to look." The officer hesitated for only a moment before lowering his voice. "Ma'am, do you mind lifting your skirt slightly, just so I can see your ankle?" The woman shook her head, her breath hitching. "No, Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. She wasn't even sure why she was resisting, but something deep within her screamed that lifting the skirt would change everything. "Please," the girl insisted. Her voice cracked, not from anger but desperation. And then, before anyone could process what was happening, the woman's body swayed. The world around her blurred, the fluorescent lights of the terminal twisting into streaks of white. A distant ringing filled her ears, and the last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her whole was the look on the girl's face. Heartbroken, desperate, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. When she awoke, the world was softer, quieter. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils. She blinked slowly, her gaze adjusting to the dim glow of fluorescent lights above her. She was lying on a small cot in what looked like a medical station inside the airport. A paramedic stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones to the police officer from before. She shifted, and that was when she felt it. A sharp, throbbing pain in her right leg. Panic surged through her chest as she struggled to sit up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I wouldn't move too quickly," the paramedic said, stepping closer. "You fainted. We checked your vitals, but everything seems normal." "Where?" Her voice trailed off. She wasn't sure what she was asking. "Where am I? Where was I before? Where is the little girl?" The police officer cleared his throat. "Miss, do you have any identification on you?" She blinked at him. That should be an easy question, but the words tangled in her throat. Identification. Her name. The breath in her chest turned shallow. I don't remember. The officer exchanged a glance with the paramedic. Your bag didn't have an ID, just some personal items. No wallet, no phone. Nothing. Panic clawed at her ribs. How could she have nothing? That didn't make sense. She tried to force the memories, but they were slippery, dissolving the moment she reached for them. Then, like a whisper from the back of her mind, something surfaced. A name. Helena. The word felt foreign and familiar all at once. The officer straightened. Your name is Helena? She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. I think so. The paramedic offered her a small cup of water, and she took it with trembling fingers. Helena, do you know where you were before you got to the airport? No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you know where you were headed? She hesitated. Her mind was a vast ocean of nothingness, and the more she tried to dive deeper, the more lost she felt. No, the officer exhaled, rubbing his temple. Miss, there was a little girl who spoke to me before you fainted. She insisted I check your leg. Do you have any idea why she would say that? Helena felt the air in her lungs freeze. Her leg, the pain. She didn't want to look, but her body moved before her mind could protest. Slowly, she pulled back the fabric of her skirt, and there, written in black ink along her skin, were two words that made the blood drain from her face. Call for backup. The room fell into a heavy silence. The officer took a sharp breath. Helena, who wrote that on you? She stared at the words, her pulse pounding in her ears. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, as if someone had deliberately left a message not just for her, but for whoever found her. I don't know. The officer turned to his radio, speaking in urgent tones, but Helena couldn't hear him anymore. The world around her blurred as another fragment of memory surfaced. Flashes of a hospital room, a man's voice whispering something she couldn't quite make out, the feeling of someone gripping her wrist tightly, a sharp pain in her leg, and then the little girl's voice, clear as day in her mind. You have to look. The door to the small medical room creaked open, and Helena's breath caught in her throat. A woman stood in the doorway, older, with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that held the weight of too many unspoken things. She stepped forward, her gaze locked onto Helena's with something unreadable in her expression. She spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Helena, it's time you remembered. A shiver ran down her spine. Somewhere deep inside, she knew everything was about to change. The weight of the woman's stare pressed against Helena's chest like a phantom hand gripping her lungs. The room, though small, felt cavernous in its silence. The woman took a step closer, the soft click of her heels against the tiled floor punctuating the growing tension. Helena's pulse pounded in her ears as she fought to keep her breathing steady. Helena? The woman repeated, her voice gentler now, as if speaking to a frightened child. It's me. You know who I am. Helena's mouth went dry. She searched the woman's face for something familiar, something to hold on to, but her mind was still a foggy void, swallowing every attempt at recollection. Her fingers twitched, still gripping the edge of her skirt as though it were the only tangible thing anchoring her to reality. Helena swallowed hard. I don't. The officer took a step forward, his radio still clutched in his hand. Ma'am, do you know this woman? His tone was cautious, but there was something else beneath it. A quiet urgency, an unspoken plea for clarity in a situation that was becoming increasingly bizarre. The woman's lips pressed together in something between relief and sorrow. Yes, she said softly. I do. Helena flinched. 1,000 questions exploded in her mind, but she couldn't form a single one. The woman's gaze flickered to Helena's exposed leg, the inked words still stark against her pale skin. Her expression darkened, and for a brief moment, Helena saw something flicker in her eyes, fear. What happened? The woman whispered, almost to herself. Helena stiffened. You tell me. The woman's gaze snapped back to hers. You really don't remember anything? A bitter laugh bubbled in Helena's throat, though it held no real amusement. That seems to be the theme of the day. The officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, I'm going to need some identification. If you know this woman, I need to confirm who she is and why she was found with. He gestured vaguely toward Helena's leg. That message. The woman hesitated for only a moment before reaching into her purse. With careful hands, she produced a worn leather wallet and handed the officer an ID. He studied it, his brow furrowing slightly before nodding. Susan Carter, he read aloud. And what exactly is your relationship to Helena? Susan's lips parted, but the answer didn't come immediately. Her hesitation sent a fresh wave of unease crawling down Helena's spine. Finally, she inhaled deeply. I'm her sister. The words crashed into Helena like a freight train. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she barely registered the way her breath hitched in her throat. Sister. The word felt foreign, strange, like it didn't belong to her. That's not possible, Helena whispered. Susan flinched as if struck. It is. Helena shook her head, gripping the edges of the cot beneath her. I don't. Her voice cracked, and she sucked in a sharp breath. I don't remember you. Pain flickered across Susan's face. I know. The weight of the confession pressed down on Helena, suffocating in its quiet devastation. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress as she tried to make sense of the puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. The officer cleared his throat again. All right, let's slow down here. Ms. Carter, when was the last time you saw your sister? Susan hesitated again, and this time it didn't go unnoticed. The officer narrowed his eyes. 3 years ago, she finally said. Before she disappeared. The room seemed to shrink around them. Helena's stomach lurched. Disappeared? She echoed. Susan nodded slowly. You were declared missing, Helena. No one knew where you went. No leads, no signs of where you could have been. Her voice wavered. Until now. Helena's hands trembled as she tried to process what she was hearing. That doesn't make any sense. How could I just disappear? We don't know, Susan admitted. One day you were just gone. We searched everywhere. The police investigated, but there was nothing. No trace of you. Her gaze softened. And now you're here. The officer ran a hand down his face. All right, let's take this one step at a time. Ms. Carter, do you have any idea where your sister might have been for the last 3 years? Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. No. Helena narrowed her eyes. There it was again, that hesitation, that carefully measured pause before she spoke. She was lying. Helena didn't know how she knew, but she did. It was an instinct, a visceral certainty that settled in her gut. The officer sighed. Okay, we're going to need to run some further checks. Given the circumstances, I'd like to keep Miss Carter here for a little longer while we figure out what's going on. Susan stiffened. Is that necessary? Yes, the officer said firmly. Helena's pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but something about the way Susan reacted made her uneasy. Susan turned back to her, her expression softer now. Helena, please, let me take you home. Home. The word felt like a distant echo of something she should recognize but didn't. Helena hesitated. She should say no. She should demand answers, insist on staying here until the police figured out the truth. But something deep inside her whispered that if she let Susan take her, she might finally find the missing pieces of herself. The officer glanced between them. Ms. Carter, I'll need you to come with me to give a formal statement. After that, we'll discuss where Helena goes from here. Susan exhaled, but she nodded. Of course. Helena's mind was spinning as the officer stepped outside to call in the necessary paperwork. Susan turned back to her, taking a hesitant step closer. I know this is overwhelming, she said softly, but I swear to you, I will help you remember. Helena met her gaze. And if I don't want to? Susan's expression faltered. Then I'll help you move forward. The sincerity in her voice sent another ripple of unease through Helena. Something wasn't right, but until she knew what, she had no choice but to follow the path laid before her. And so, as she watched Susan turn to speak with the officer, one thought echoed in her mind. She had to find out the truth before it was too late. The ride from the airport was suffocatingly quiet. The streets outside the car window blurred together in a mess of neon signs and flickering streetlights. Helena sat in the passenger seat, her fingers twisting in her lap, while Susan gripped the steering wheel with a tension that felt nearly tangible. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving the airport. The police had eventually agreed to release Helena into Susan's custody under the condition that she return for further questioning. It had been a long process, filled with paperwork and lingering glances from the officers, none of whom seemed entirely sure if they believed Susan's story. Helena wasn't sure if she believed it either. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice scratchy from exhaustion. Susan didn't take her eyes off the road. "Home." The word sat heavy in the air between them. Helena shifted in her seat. "You keep saying that, but I don't remember any home." Susan's grip on the wheel tightened. "I know." Something in her tone sent a chill through Helena's spine. It wasn't sadness, it was something closer to guilt. They drove in silence for several more minutes before the car pulled onto a narrow, tree-lined street. The houses here were older, each one with small front porches and dimly lit windows. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where secrets had nowhere to hide. Susan slowed the car in front of a pale yellow house with white shutters. It was simple, unassuming, but something about it made Helena's stomach twist uncomfortably. Susan turned off the ignition and exhaled before glancing at her. "This was your home." Helena stared at the house, waiting for something, anything, to click into place. But there was nothing. No flicker of recognition, no warmth of nostalgia. Just emptiness. Susan must have noticed because she quickly reached over and squeezed Helena's hand. "Come inside. Maybe being here will help." Helena hesitated, but she eventually followed her sister up the front steps. The moment Susan pushed the door open, the scent of lavender and old wood filled the air. The house was warm, cozy, but eerily unfamiliar. She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the space. The living room was modest, with a gray couch, a bookshelf filled with old hardcovers, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Family photos lined the walls, and Helena found herself drawn to them. She stopped in front of one particular frame. It was an old photograph, slightly faded at the edges. In it, a younger version of herself stood beside Susan, both of them smiling. They looked happy, but Helena felt nothing. She touched the glass, tracing the outline of her face. "Why don't I remember any of this?" Susan stood behind her. "You will." Helena turned to her. "What if I don't?" For a moment, Susan looked as though she wanted to say something, but then she just shook her head. "You should get some rest." Helena wanted to argue, to demand answers, but exhaustion weighed too heavily on her. Susan led her down a hallway to a bedroom. The walls were painted a soft blue, and the bed was neatly made, as if it had been waiting for her return. "This was your room," Susan said quietly. Helena stepped inside slowly. There were books on the nightstand. A knitted throw blanket draped over the chair in the corner. Felt lived in. And yet, she didn't recognize any of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the sheets. "Susan." Susan hesitated in the doorway. "Yeah." Helena glanced up at her. "Are you telling me everything?" Susan's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes. Something guarded. Of course. She was lying. Helena didn't know how she knew, but she did. Still, she was too tired to push further. Susan gave her a small smile. "Get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Helena exhaled, rubbing her temples. Her mind was still spinning, her body aching from the weight of too many unanswered questions. She lay down, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. But then, a sound. Soft, faint, almost imperceptible. A creak. Helena stiffened. Came from outside her door. Her breath hitched as she listened, heart pounding. Then, a whisper, so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. "You have to remember." Helena shot up in bed, her chest tight with panic. She turned toward the door, but when she opened it, the hallway was empty. Helena's heart pounded so violently against her ribs that for a moment, she thought she could hear it echoing through the silent house. She remained frozen on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened hallway beyond her slightly open door. The whisper had been so faint, so fragile, that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Almost. She inhaled shakily, forcing herself to move. Every step toward the doorway felt like stepping into something unknown, something dangerous, though she had no proof of why she felt that way. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering in through the windows. The old wooden floorboards groaned softly beneath her bare feet as she stepped into the corridor. "Susan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No answer. A shiver crawled down her spine. She turned towards Susan's room, the door slightly ajar. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed it open further, peering inside. Susan was lying in bed, motionless, her breathing deep and steady. Asleep. Helena hesitated. If Susan was here, then who had whispered? Her pulse quickened as she stepped back into the hallway. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unexplainable. She glanced toward the living room, where the faintest glow from the streetlights outside illuminated the furniture in a soft, eerie glow. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet something felt very, very wrong. She moved toward the staircase leading down to the first floor. The house was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As she reached the bottom step, she hesitated. The feeling of familiarity she had been waiting for since she arrived in this house never came. If this was truly her home, why did it feel like she was trespassing? Then, a noise, a soft thud, coming from the far end of the house. Helena's breath caught in her throat as she turned her head toward the source of the sound. The door to the small office near the back of the house was slightly open, just enough to show the sliver of darkness beyond it. Her fingers curled into fists as she took a step closer. The closer she got, the more she realized something strange. There was a faint scent of dust and old paper in the air, like the room hadn't been disturbed in years. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open fully. The office was small, with a large wooden desk against the wall, old books stacked neatly along the shelves, and a chair sitting slightly off-center, as if someone had left in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the desk, but it was the one object in the middle of it that caught her attention. A single, old photograph. Helena's stomach twisted as she stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the image before finally picking it up. It was a picture of her, or at least it looked like her, but there was something off. The woman in the photo had the same green eyes, the same soft features, but her hair was different, darker, shorter. She was standing next to a man. His face was partially obscured by the angle, but there was something familiar about him, something that made Helena's chest tighten. Her eyes flickered downward. There was a handwritten date on the bottom of the photograph. March 19th, 2018. 3 years ago. Her breath hitched. If she had disappeared 3 years ago, then this photo must have been taken just before everything went blank. But who was the man? Why was this photo hidden here? She turned the picture over, her fingers shaking. On the back, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, was a single line. "You were never supposed to come back." A sharp chill shot through her veins. Helena's entire body went rigid, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The whisper from earlier, the unease in her chest, the way Susan hesitated when asked about her past. It all came crashing down on her at once. Someone didn't want her here. A creak echoed from behind her. She spun around so fast that the photograph nearly slipped from her fingers. Susan stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, shadowed by the dim lighting of the hallway. "What are you doing?" Susan's voice was careful, measured. Helena swallowed hard, gripping the photo. She hesitated. The instinct to hide it, to keep it to herself, was overwhelming, but she forced herself to hold it up instead. "What is this?" Susan's eyes flickered to the picture, and for the first time Helena saw it. Fear. It was only for a second, but it was there, like a fleeting crack in the mask Susan had been wearing since the moment they left the airport. Susan stepped forward slowly, too slowly. Where did you find that? Helena didn't answer. Instead, she studied Susan's face, searching for a sign of truth. Who is he? Susan exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. Helena, listen to me. No, Helena took a step back, gripping the photo tighter. You're hiding something. I can feel it. Susan's jaw clenched. It's complicated. Helena let out a bitter laugh. Everything's complicated, Susan. I don't remember anything. I don't know where I've been for 3 years. I don't know why there's a message written on my leg. And I sure as hell don't know why I feel like I don't belong here. Susan hesitated again. That same hesitation that had been there since the moment they reunited. Helena took another step back. Tell me the truth. Susan exhaled slowly, as if coming to a decision. Then, softly, you don't remember him, do you? The question sent a wave of nausea through Helena's stomach. She didn't, but something inside her screamed that she should. She shook her head, gripping the photo so tightly that the edges crumpled. Who is he? Susan's gaze dropped, as if looking at her was suddenly too much to bear. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Michael. Helena's breath caught. The name sent an electric jolt through her system, a flash of something, an image, a feeling just out of reach. She clutched her head, trying to hold on to it, trying to pull it closer, but it slipped away before she could grasp it. Susan watched her carefully. Helena, he was your fiancé. The world tilted. No, that wasn't possible. But the way Susan was looking at her, the way her voice trembled, Helena stumbled back, shaking her head. I don't. Another flash, a laugh, a hand brushing against hers. The scent of coffee on a cold morning. Gone before she could make sense of it. She sucked in a sharp breath. Why didn't you tell me? Susan looked away. Because he's gone. The words slammed into Helena like a physical blow. Gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Helena felt like the floor was crumbling beneath her feet. Nothing made sense, but at the same time, something deep inside her whispered that this was only the beginning, that there was still so much she didn't know, and that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready for the answers. Helena's breath came in short, uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The walls of the dimly lit office seemed to close in on her, the weight of Susan's words pressing down like a force she couldn't escape. His name was Michael. He was your fiancé. He's gone. The words echoed in her mind, distorting, twisting into something unbearable. She wanted to scream, to shake Susan until the truth spilled from her lips like a broken dam, but she couldn't move. Her fingers trembled as she looked down at the old photograph again. The man, Michael, stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist as if he had done it 1,000 times before. There was warmth in his expression, and ease in his stance. And yet, staring at him, Helena felt nothing. No recognition, no flicker of nostalgia, nothing but a gnawing emptiness where memories should have been. She forced her gaze back to Susan, her voice barely above a whisper. How did he die? Susan hesitated. Again, the hesitation sent a wave of nausea through Helena's stomach. Tell me the truth. Susan exhaled, running a hand through her hair, her posture rigid, like she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, too careful. He died in an accident. Helena's hands clenched. What kind of accident? A car accident. Something sharp twisted in Helena's gut. When? Susan's eyes flickered, barely perceptible, but enough for Helena to catch it. Around the same time you disappeared. The words sent a violent shiver down her spine. Helena took a step back. That doesn't make any sense. Susan swallowed hard. I know. Helena turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead. Her mind was spinning, fragments of thoughts colliding and breaking apart before she could make sense of them. Michael, a fiancé she didn't remember, a man she had supposedly loved, and then gone, just like that, and she had disappeared right after? The timeline felt too convenient, too neat. It didn't add up. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. Where did it happen? Susan hesitated again. Helena's patience snapped. Stop lying to me. The sudden outburst made Susan flinch. For a moment, she looked exhausted, defeated, as if holding onto this secret had been draining her for years. Then softly, near the old lake house, the words were quiet, but they hit Helena like a punch to the ribs. A flash, so quick, so fleeting she almost didn't catch it. A wooden dock stretching over still water. The scent of damp earth. Laughter carried on the wind. The sensation of warm hands gripping hers. And then nothing. She gasped, stumbling back. Susan moved toward her, but Helena raised a hand, stopping her. No, her voice was hoarse. No, don't touch me. Susan's expression cracked for the first time, something close to pain flashing across her face. Helena, I need to go there. Susan stiffened. What? The lake house. Helena's heart pounded in her ears. If what you're saying is true, if Michael died there, if I disappeared right after. She shook her head. I need to see it. Maybe it'll help me remember. Susan's face drained of color. No. The answer came so quickly, so forcefully, that it only solidified Helena's suspicions. Something had happened there. Something Susan didn't want her to know. Helena squared her shoulders. Then I'll go alone. Susan's eyes widened, panic flashing across her features. You can't. Why not? Silence. Helena's stomach twisted. There was something wrong with all of this. She turned on her heel, heading toward the hallway. Susan was right behind her. Helena, please, just wait. But Helena wasn't listening. She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair in the hallway and yanked open the front door. Cold night air rushed against her skin, sending a violent shiver down her spine. But she didn't stop. She stepped onto the porch, the damp scent of earth thick in the air. The quiet suburban street stretched out before her, lined with old houses and flickering streetlights. And then, she saw her, the little girl, standing at the end of the driveway. Helena's breath hitched violently. The same girl from the airport. Her brown braids, her small frame barely illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. She wasn't moving, just watching. Helena felt something deep in her bones. Something old, something primal. Helena! Susan's voice was barely a whisper behind her, but Helena didn't turn. The little girl knew something. Helena took a slow step forward. Who are you? The girl's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed, not at Helena, not at Susan, but past them, toward the house. The air turned electric, the hairs on the back of Helena's neck standing on end. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Helena gasped, her breath fogging in the cold air. She stumbled forward, but the driveway was empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Behind her, Susan let out a slow, shaky breath. Helena, she murmured. Helena turned, her hands shaking. I'm going to that lake house, she whispered. Susan's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might fight it. But then, finally, she nodded. Helena swallowed hard. She didn't know what she would find there, but something told her she wasn't ready for the truth. The road to the lake house stretched endlessly before them, swallowed by the looming darkness of the trees. The headlights of Susan's car cut through the mist curling along the asphalt, but the further they drove, the more Helena felt like they were descending into something far deeper than just a place. Felt like stepping into a forgotten memory. She gripped the edge of her seat, her breath shallow as she stared out the window. The trees were familiar, not in the way a home should be, but in the way something half-remembered clings to the back of your mind, just out of reach. She had been here before. That much she knew. Susan's hands were tight on the wheel, her knuckles white, her jaw set in silent tension. She hadn't spoken since they left, and Helena didn't push her. There was nothing to say, only the undeniable truth that whatever awaited them at that lake house was something Susan had spent years trying to bury. Helena wasn't sure if she was ready to dig it up. The car slowed as they turned onto a narrow dirt road. The sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires sent a chill through her spine. Ahead, barely visible through the thick branches, was the lake house. A two-story cabin, its wooden exterior worn by time, its windows dark, lifeless. The air around it felt different, too still, too heavy. Susan killed the engine but made no move to get out. Her grip on the steering wheel remained firm, as if she were holding herself in place. Helena swallowed hard. "You don't want to be here." Susan let out a slow, measured breath. "No." Helena stared at her. "Then why did you agree to come?" Susan turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Because you were going to come anyway." Helena felt something shift in her chest. Susan knew. She had always known that Helena would end up back here. Helena pushed the car door open, the crisp night air hitting her like a shock to the system. The scent of pine and damp earth was thick, almost suffocating. The lake lay just beyond the trees, its surface smooth and untouched, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. She took slow steps toward the house, her body tense with something unnameable. Susan followed, her footsteps hesitant, reluctant. The front porch creaked beneath their weight. Helena reached for the doorknob, her fingers cold against the metal. It wasn't locked. The door swung open with an eerie ease, revealing a space frozen in time. The air inside was stale, dust settled over every surface. The furniture remained exactly where it had been left, the cushions sunken slightly, a coffee mug still sitting on the table, untouched. It was as if the house had been waiting for them. Helena stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning under her weight. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. A whisper of something familiar, tugged at the edge of her mind. She turned to Susan. "What happened here?" Susan inhaled sharply, looking around as if the walls themselves carried ghosts. Then, quietly, "This is where they found his car." The words sent a bolt of ice through Helena's veins. "Michael, the accident." Her stomach clenched. "Where?" Susan hesitated before pointing toward the back of the house. "The dock." Helena didn't wait. She moved, her body acting before her mind could catch up. She pushed open the back door, stepping onto the wooden deck that led down to the dock. The lake stretched out before her, eerily still, the reflection of the moon rippling slightly with the faintest breeze. The dock was old, its wood weathered from years of exposure to the elements. But as Helena stepped onto it, something in her body recoiled, an involuntary shudder that ran through her bones. Something happened here. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and then, flash, the scent of rain, the sound of tires skidding against gravel. A scream. Helena's eyes flew open, her breath sharp and ragged. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the wooden railing for support. Susan was behind her in an instant. "Helena!" Helena shook her head, trying to catch her breath. "I saw something." Susan paled. "What?" Helena pressed a hand to her temple. "I don't know. It was so fast. But I heard something. Tires." A scream. Susan exhaled shakily. It was raining that night. Helena looked at her sharply. Susan hesitated before continuing. "The police said he lost control, that his car skidded off the road and into the lake." Helena's heart pounded. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Susan's expression darkened. Helena grabbed her wrist. "Tell me the truth." Susan's breath trembled. "Then, I think you were in the car with him." The words knocked the air from Helena's lungs. She stumbled back, gripping the railing as her world tilted dangerously. "No," she whispered. Susan's gaze was pained, haunted. "I don't know for sure, but Helena, after Michael's accident, you vanished. There were no signs of you, no evidence that you had left on your own. It was like you disappeared into thin air." Helena's hands shook violently. "Then why didn't the police? They never found a second body." Susan's voice cracked. "The car was in the lake, the windows shattered, but you weren't inside." Helena's head spun. None of this made sense. If she had been in the car, how had she survived? And why couldn't she remember? The whisper of a memory brushed against her mind again. Michael's voice. "You have to run." Her breath hitched. Susan's eyes widened. "What is it?" Helena clutched her head. "I." A sudden gust of wind sent a violent ripple through the lake's surface. The dock creaked beneath them, and then a sound, distant, echoing. A voice, a whisper. Helena's body went rigid. It was the same voice from the house, the same one from before. "You have to remember." She turned, but there was no one there. Susan grabbed her arm. "Helena." Helena's throat was dry. "Someone was here." Susan's face paled. "What do you mean?" Helena shook her head. "A voice. I heard it again." Susan's grip tightened. "Helena, there's no one here." Helena turned back toward the lake. The water was calm again, still, as if nothing had disturbed it. But deep in her gut she knew something had, and whatever it wasn't finished with her yet. The weight of the night pressed against Helena's skin as she stood on the dock, her breath unsteady, her mind spinning with fragments of a truth she still couldn't grasp. The lake stretched before her, an abyss of black water reflecting the moonlight in ripples too faint to be real. She could feel it, something lingering beneath the surface, something waiting. Susan's grip on her arm was firm, almost desperate. "Helena, listen to me. We need to leave." Helena barely registered the words. Her fingers trembled as she stared into the depths of the lake. "What if I was here that night?" Susan swallowed hard. "We don't know that for sure." Helena turned sharply. "But you believe it." Susan hesitated. Don't lie to me." Helena's voice was hoarse. "You believe it." Susan exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "Yes." The confirmation sent a wave of nausea through Helena's stomach. She pressed a hand to her temple, the edges of a headache creeping in. The whispers in her mind, the flashes of something just out of reach, they were getting stronger. She took a slow, unsteady step toward the edge of the dock. The wood creaked beneath her, the water beneath her feet dark and endless. "What if I didn't disappear?" Susan frowned. "What?" Helena's pulse pounded. "What if someone made me disappear?" Susan's breath hitched. "Helena, what if Michael didn't just lose control?" Her voice wavered. "What if someone wanted him dead?" The words hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Susan's face paled. "That's not." Helena turned to her. "You know something." Susan's lips parted, but no words came. Helena stepped closer, the desperation clawing at her throat. "Tell me." Susan hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, "Michael was investigating something." Helena's stomach twisted. "Investigating?" Susan looked away. "Before he died, he was looking into something. He told me he had found something important. Something dangerous." Helena's breath caught. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Susan's voice wavered. "Because I didn't think it mattered anymore. You were gone, Helena. I didn't know if you were dead or alive. I didn't know if you'd ever come back." Helena's hands clenched. "What was he investigating?" Susan hesitated. Then, finally, "I don't know." Helena's heart pounded. "You're lying." Susan's jaw tightened. "No, I swear. I only know that it had something to do with his work." Helena inhaled sharply. "His work?" Susan nodded. "Michael was a journalist, Helena. He was working on a story, but he never told me what it was about. All I know is that a few weeks before the accident, he started acting different." Helena's stomach churned. "Different how?" Susan's gaze darkened. "Paranoid. He kept saying he was being watched, that someone was following him." A chill ran down Helena's spine. Susan continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night he died, he told me he was going to meet someone. He said it was important, that it would change everything." Helena's breath hitched. "And then he died." Susan nodded. Helena turned back toward the lake, her hands shaking. Michael was onto something, and someone wanted to stop him. Was that why she had disappeared? Had she known something too? The thought sent a violent shudder through her body. Then suddenly, flash, A memory. She was in a car. Rain pounded against the windshield. Headlights illuminated the road ahead, cutting through the storm. Michael's voice, urgent, desperate. "They know, Helena. They know everything." Helena gasped, stumbling back. Susan caught her. "Helena." Helena clutched her head, her pulse erratic. I remembered something." Susan's grip tightened. "What did you see?" Helena's breathing was shallow. "Michael. He was driving. It was raining. He said, they know everything." Susan's expression twisted with something close to fear. "Helena, you need to stop." But Helena shook her head violently. No, I need to remember." She turned back to the lake, her heart racing. Michael had been afraid. He had known something, and someone had made sure he didn't live to tell the truth. But why had she survived? And why couldn't she remember? A gust of wind rushed through the trees, sending a shiver through her bones. Then, a voice, soft, faint. "Helena." Helena's body went rigid. Susan's breath hitched. "Did you hear that?" Helena turned, her blood turning to ice. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. A man, tall, still, watching. Helena's breath caught violently in her throat. Susan grabbed her arm. "We have to go." Helena couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Helena's pulse roared in her ears. She knew him, even if she couldn't remember why. She knew him, and in that moment, she realized the truth. She had never disappeared. She had been taken. The world around her tilted, a slow, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest as she stared at the shadowed figure standing just beyond the tree line. The night had swallowed him whole, but she could see the outline of his body, the stillness of his posture. He wasn't moving. He wasn't approaching. He was just watching. Helena's breath turned shallow, the cold air burning her lungs. Her entire body screamed for her to move, to run, but she couldn't, because deep in her bones, she knew him. The thought sent a violent shudder through her. Susan was still gripping her arm, her fingers digging into Helena's skin. "Helena, we need to go. Now." But Helena barely heard her. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. The man didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting. Then, a step forward. Not rushed, not aggressive, just slow, deliberate. Helena gasped. Susan pulled her back sharply. "Get in the car." Helena hesitated. The man took another step. Something in her chest twisted violently. Michael. The car. The accident. Flashes of rain. The sound of tires skidding. His voice urgent, desperate. "They know everything. We have to leave now." Helena's breath hitched. The figure took another step forward, and in the dim glow of the moonlight, she saw it. A scar, running from his left temple down to his cheekbone. Her stomach lurched. Her knees buckled, and Susan had to physically hold her up. Because she remembered. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know she had seen him before. Her mouth opened, a whisper barely escaping. "No!" Susan didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed Helena's wrist and yanked her backward toward the car. "Move!" Helena stumbled, her legs weak beneath her, but she forced herself to follow. Another step. The man's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Helena!" She nearly collapsed. The sound of her own name from his lips sent something cold and sharp through her veins. Susan shoved her into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut before racing around to the driver's side. The second the engine roared to life, the headlights flashed across the man's face. And that's when she saw it. His eyes, familiar, and filled with something far worse than anger. Regret. Susan threw the car into reverse, kicking up gravel as she spun the wheel. The tires screeched as she turned onto the road, the headlights swinging wildly before plunging into darkness. Helena gasped for air, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the seat. The man hadn't chased them, hadn't moved at all. He had just watched them leave. Susan's hands were locked around the steering wheel, her knuckles bone white, her jaw set with tension. Helena, she forced out, her voice rough. Who the hell was that? Helena couldn't answer, because she didn't know. But at the same time, she did. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the memories to come faster, to fill in the gaps. But it was like chasing smoke. One thing was clear. She had never disappeared. She had been taken. And now, after all these years, he had found her. The house was dark when they returned. Susan parked in the driveway but made no move to get out of the car. Helena sat in silence, staring at the house, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. Susan finally exhaled, rubbing a shaking hand down her face. Helena. Helena swallowed hard. Susan turned to her. What the hell is going on? Helena opened her mouth, then closed it. She shook her head. I don't know. Susan stared at her, something unreadable in her expression. You knew him. It wasn't a question. Helena hesitated. I don't. Don't lie to me. Helena's breath caught. Susan's voice softened slightly. Helena, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know that man? Helena felt the words in her throat, heavy, suffocating. Then finally, yes. Susan's hands curled into fists. Helena gripped her seatbelt, staring out into the darkness. I don't know how. I don't remember. But I know I've seen him before. Susan exhaled shakily. You think he was there the night Michael died? Helena's chest constricted. She didn't think it. She knew it. But saying it aloud felt like stepping off a ledge. I don't know. The words tasted like a lie. Susan studied her. Do you trust me? Helena's breath hitched. Did she? She wanted to. But something about all of this, about the way Susan hesitated, the way she had withheld things. I don't know, Helena admitted. Pain flickered across Susan's face. Then finally she nodded. Get some rest. Helena wanted to argue, wanted to demand more answers, but exhaustion was pulling her under. She climbed out of the car and followed Susan into the house. But sleep never came. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the missing pieces to fit together. But they never did. And when she finally closed her eyes, the only thing she saw was his face, the scar, the eyes filled with regret, and the whisper of a name that made her blood run cold. Ethan. Helena couldn't breathe. The name echoed inside her skull like a forgotten melody, one that had been playing just beyond her reach for years. Ethan. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory buried deep, clawing its way back to the surface. She could feel it, hovering just on the edge of recognition, but every time she reached for it, it slipped through her fingers like sand. The scar. The eyes filled with something that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite sorrow. The way he had stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for her to acknowledge him. Why did she know him? Why did the sight of him feel like something out of a nightmare? Helena sat up in bed, gasping, her fingers tangled in the sheets. Her skin was clammy, her breath ragged. The room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight slipping through the curtains. She wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw it. Presence. Her chest tightened as she turned her head toward the doorway. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was Susan. Helena nearly screamed. Susan took a step forward, her expression unreadable. I heard you. Helena swallowed hard. What? Susan exhaled, rubbing a hand down her face. You said a name in your sleep. Helena's blood ran cold. Susan's eyes locked onto hers. Ethan. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with something neither of them could name. Helena's fingers tightened around the sheets. I don't know why I said it. Susan didn't blink. Yes, you do. Helena's stomach churned. Because she did. Somewhere deep inside, she knew exactly who Ethan was. And the truth was trying to force its way out. Helena swung her legs over the side of the bed, forcing herself to stand despite the way her body trembled. Tell me, she whispered. Susan hesitated. Helena took a shaky step toward her. You know who he is. Susan exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead. Helena, tell me the truth. Susan's jaw tightened. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she met Helena's gaze. "He was your fiancé's best friend." The words slammed into Helena like a tidal wave, sending her reeling. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the nightstand for support. "No." Susan's expression didn't waver. "Yes." Helena shook her head violently. "That's not possible." But it was. Because now that the truth had been spoken aloud, she remembered. The memories hit her all at once. A flood of images and emotions that stole the air from her lungs. Michael. Ethan. Laughter over coffee. Arguments in the car. Ethan standing beside Michael, arms crossed, expression tense. The two of them locked in whispered conversations when they thought she wasn't looking. And then, Michael's voice urgent, afraid. "He's not who you think he is." Helena gasped, clutching her head. Susan rushed to her side, gripping her shoulders. "Breathe, Helena. Breathe." Helena's lungs burned, but she forced herself to inhale. The room spun, her vision flickering between past and present. Ethan. Michael had warned her about him. Helena's voice was barely a whisper. "What did he do?" Susan's grip tightened. Helena lifted her head, meeting her sister's gaze. "What did Ethan do?" Susan swallowed hard. "I don't know everything." Helena's hands trembled. "Then tell me what you do know." Susan hesitated. Then softly, "Michael was afraid of him." Helena's breath hitched. Susan continued. "I didn't understand it at first. They had been friends for years, best friends. But toward the end, Michael changed. He stopped trusting Ethan. He kept saying something wasn't right." Helena's stomach twisted painfully. Michael had known, and no one had listened. She closed her eyes, another memory surfacing. Conversation. A fight. Michael gripping her hands, his voice desperate. "Helena, you have to trust me. Ethan, he's dangerous. He's not who he says he is." Helena's breath shuddered. She had argued with him, had told him he was being paranoid. She hadn't believed him. And then, the accident, the crash, the night that had stolen everything. She felt sick. Susan was still watching her, waiting. Helena forced herself to meet her gaze. "He's not just a man from my past, is he?" Susan exhaled shakily. "No." Helena's stomach twisted violently. "He was at the lake house for a reason." Susan didn't answer. She didn't have to. Helena already knew. Ethan had been waiting for her. The truth sat heavy in her chest, like a weight pressing down on her ribs, making it hard to breathe. Ethan had been Michael's best friend. Michael had been afraid of him. And now, years later, Ethan had found her. Helena stood frozen in the middle of the dimly lit bedroom, the air between her and Susan thick with everything left unsaid. Her mind was spinning, pieces of memories clicking together in a way that made her stomach churn. Ethan wasn't just from her past. He was part of the reason she had disappeared. Susan finally broke the silence. "What are you going to do?" Helena swallowed hard. "I need to see him." Susan's face paled. "Helena, no." But Helena didn't waver. "I have to." Susan shook her head, her voice rising in desperation. "Why? He's dangerous. Michael warned you about him. And then he died. Don't you see? This isn't a coincidence." Helena's pulse pounded. "Exactly. And that's why I have to face him." Susan ran a hand through her hair, frustration and fear warring in her eyes. "Helena, listen to me. You don't owe him anything. He disappeared after Michael's death. He let the world believe you were gone. He knows more than he's telling you." Helena's hands clenched. "I know." Susan blinked. Helena met her gaze, steady now. "And that's why I have to talk to him." Susan exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment before looking back at her. "Then I'm coming with you." Helena hesitated. Susan took a step closer. "I lost you once. I'm not losing you again." Helena studied her for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. The air was cold as they pulled into the airport parking lot. Helena's heart pounded so violently she could feel it in her throat. The plan had been simple. Susan had used her contacts to track Ethan's whereabouts. He had booked a last-minute flight, He was leaving, running. Helena had one chance to stop him. She stepped out of the car, her breath fogging in the crisp night air. The terminal loomed ahead, glowing in artificial light, filled with the distant hum of late-night travelers. Susan stood beside her. "Are you sure about this?" Helena nodded, though her body was screaming at her to run in the opposite direction. They moved quickly through the crowd, scanning the faces around them. And then, there he was, standing near the security checkpoint, his posture relaxed, his hands in the pockets of his coat, waiting, as if he had expected this. Helena's stomach clenched, but she forced herself forward. Susan was at her side, her presence grounding. Ethan's eyes found her immediately. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly he smiled. It wasn't a smirk, wasn't smug. It was knowing. Helena's breath hitched. Susan tensed beside her. Helena forced herself to step closer, closing the space between them until she was just a few feet away. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You came." Helena's hands curled into fists. "You were waiting." He nodded once. "I was." Helena's chest ached. "Why?" Ethan's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his expression. "Because you're finally ready to remember." The words sent a chill down her spine. Susan stepped forward, her voice sharp. "What do you want from her?" Ethan barely glanced at her. "It's not about what I want. It's about what she deserves to know." Helena's breath shuddered. "Then tell me what happened that night." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You already know." Helena's pulse pounded. "I don't remember everything." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "You will." Susan scoffed. "Enough with the cryptic answers. Just say it." Ethan's gaze darkened, but he nodded. Then, quietly, "Michael was murdered." The world tilted. Helena staggered back, gasping. Susan sucked in a sharp breath. "What?" Ethan's face was unreadable. It wasn't an accident. He didn't lose control of the car. Someone made sure he didn't survive. Helena shook her head violently. No, the police said." "The police were wrong." Helena's throat tightened. Ethan took a slow step forward. "Michael found something big. He was investigating it for months. He was getting too close." Helena's breath shuddered. "To what?" Ethan hesitated. Then, "To me." The words sent ice through her veins. Ethan's gaze was steady. "Michael found out something about me. Something that put him in danger." Helena's vision blurred. "What did he find?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "That I wasn't who I said I was." The words barely registered. Susan's voice was sharp. "What does that mean?" Ethan sighed. "It means Michael was right. I was lying to him. I was lying to both of you." Helena's breath hitched. Ethan exhaled, his voice quieter now. "Michael tried to warn you, but you didn't believe him." Helena gasped. The memory hit her all at once. Michael gripping her hands, his voice desperate, telling her not to trust Ethan. Tears burned her eyes. Ethan's gaze softened. "You didn't know." Helena swallowed hard. "But I should have." Ethan's eyes flickered with something close to sorrow. "I tried to save you, Helena." Her chest ached. "Then why did I disappear?" Ethan exhaled. "Because they came for you, too." Helena's breath hitched. Ethan continued. "After Michael died, I knew they would come for you next. I had to make sure you were safe." Helena's head spun. "You took me?" Ethan nodded once. Helena's stomach twisted violently. "You erased my life." Ethan's expression darkened. "I saved your life." Helena's pulse pounded. Ethan took another step forward. "They would have killed you, Helena. You know that, don't you?" Helena's throat tightened. Ethan's voice softened. "I did what I had to do." Helena's body trembled. Then slowly, "Who are they?" Ethan hesitated. Then, "They're still watching." The words sent ice through her veins. Susan stiffened beside her. "What?" Ethan's expression was grim. "They know you're remembering." Helena's breath shuddered. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "If you want the truth, you have to be ready for what comes next." Helena's heart pounded. Ethan's eyes met hers. And then, quietly, "They're not done with you." The airport suddenly felt suffocating, the walls pressing in around her. The weight of everything came crashing down, the truth, the lies, the missing years, and the realization that this wasn't over, that it had never been over. Helena's breath shuddered. She had spent years lost in the dark. But now the real story was just beginning.